Do you know, we church historians are the lowest form of human life, and I can prove it in 3 steps. First step, if you're a Christian, the people around you, in family, work, friends and so on, neighbours, that they might eventually forgive you for it, but they will never actually appreciate you for this fact. But if you prove yourself an okay person in every other respect, they might grudgingly accept you. Step number 2, you're a Christian now and you're in the church, and you are a theologically minded person, and the other people in your church are really suspicious of you, right? They'd be okay if you were a scientist or if you were working in computers or drilling for oil or something like that. But theology, no. They're going to mislead us. They're going to mislead themselves and then they'll mislead us. Okay, that's step number 2. Thirdly, okay, you are now a theological type person in the theological academy, the theological college, or whatever it is, and you're the church historian. And the New Testament people and the Old Testament people and the one who teaches Greek and the one who teaches Hebrew are looking askance at you because they know that none of this stuff is actually relevant. All that matters is just you and the Bible, and they're certain that they can leap over 2,000 years of history to get to this point. So there you are. In each category, you are at the bottom of the pile.
And why this long, complicated explanation to prove what we can see for ourselves anyways?
Look, if you're going to be like that, Mrs. Campo...
Hi everybody, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where of course we're exploring history, religion, and culture and why they matter. As you remember, Mount Olympus was that place where the Greek gods lived, so an Olympian judgment being dispassionate, impartial, and most importantly delivered from far above the mortals down below. It's what we are aspiring to, but of course, the fog. And my name is Coel Campo.
And I'm Mike Pierce, and today we're wrapping up our short series on the nature of history by looking at the specifics of church history. We've called it The Living Faith of the Dead, Why Church History Matters, and we're picking up on this famous quotation from Jaroslav Pelikan, maybe the greatest scholar of historical theology. And this line from him: tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. Now, he wrote a whole stack of books during his long life, and the most famous is, and remains today, his 5-volume Historical Theology, which doesn't sound very exciting, but it is an absolutely brilliant series of books. I have found it endlessly useful during the whole of my teaching career. It's not the kind of thing that you'd sit down and read your way through, though you could. It's not difficult, but for use as a reference book, it's absolutely fantastic. And although he had, of course, his own convictions, as everybody does, they are not made obvious through the book. Whatever your point of view, if you consult him, you cannot complain that he has dealt with you unfairly. And in fact, I obtained my copy as a present from someone who shared a research basement with me in Oxford when I was doing my postgrad work. I was fortunate enough in the 1980s to share a research basement with Dave Reimer, who was a Canadian with a surname like that. You can tell that he had a Mennonite background, even if that wasn't where he ended up. And so he was typing away for several years in one corner of the room on his computer. He was working on Old Testament. I was working on church history the other side. And every now and again, well, pretty much every day that we were both down there, at some point, one of us would turn around, look at the other and say, fancy a quick frame, because our college was the only one in Oxford with a full-size snooker table in an adjoining room. So we wasted far too many hours there messing around with that. Okay, so when I came to leave, he bought me this series as a present, and it's been, as I say, inestimably valuable ever since, and even wrote me a little rhyme in the front. Hillary Term, 1989. Mike Pierce is so wonderfully bright, he reads history from morning to night, but polemicization is his recreation, which is the historian's right. Brackets, but is it his responsibility? So, if you're a pastor, or you're going to be teaching this kind of stuff, or studying it, I would recommend you to get that. I'm sure that you can get the entire set in paperback for probably not more than $100, and it'll last your lifetime. It's not going to go out of date. So, quick book plug there. Well, let's have a look at a key passage from Pelikan in which he talks about the need to balance a study of history with a respect for tradition. And you'll be able to tell that this is written with a slight twinkle in his eye. There is a sense, he says, in which the very notion of tradition seems inconsistent with the idea of history as movement and change. For tradition is thought to be ancient, hallowed by age, unchanged since it was first established once upon a time. It doesn't have a history, since history implies the appearance at a certain point in time of that which hadn't been there before. According to the ecclesiastical history of Eusebius, Orthodox Christian doctrine didn't really have a history, having been true eternally and taught primitively, that is, in the earliest church. Only heresy had a history, having arisen at particular times and through the innovations of particular teachers. Roman Catholic polemics has frequently contrasted the variations of Protestantism with the stable and unchanging doctrine of Roman Catholicism.
And before we go on, can you remind us, or in some of our cases, tell us perhaps for the first time what the ecclesiastical history of Eusebius was?
Well, Eusebius he's often counted as one of the church fathers. He was Constantine's pet clergyman, basically, and he's often mocked for that. He's not considered to be intellectually quite the same caliber as a lot of the other church fathers. But his ecclesiastical history is jolly useful all the same. It's the first history of the church that we possess, and it's written obviously telling the story up to his own time. Now, a lot of the things that he tells us about, we know from other sources anyway, we don't need him. But in some cases, we're dependent entirely on what he tells us. The thing that is the nuisance about his history is that he was so excited that Constantine had stopped the persecution of Christians, and he was always praising Constantine. He even wrote a biography of the guy, which is sickeningly hagiographic, saying how wonderful he was. Yeah, so he has an idea of what is orthodoxy, and as Pelikan is explaining to us, Eusebius didn't think that orthodoxy had a history. It had always been like an only heresy had a history. Well, okay, so he goes on. It seems that theologians have been willing to trace the history of doctrines and doctrinal systems which they found to be in error, but that the normative tradition, as understood by themselves, had to be protected from the relativity of having a history, or of being in any decisive sense the product of a history. Let me just explain here, perhaps in my own case. All right, I've got my theological opinions, and I'm happy to point out that some of those that I disagree with weren't around in the early centuries of the church, that they appeared at a certain point of time, often under, let us say, discreditable circumstances, and that from those facts you can deduce that these ideas might be wrong. Right? Well, what about the things that I think? Well, I'm perhaps an exception to the rule of a lot of Christians in that, whilst I could play the "well, the Bible says" game, I know all too well that everybody can play that game, right? And so what I tend to do is to look back and say, well, what did the earliest Christians make of these texts? Because, I think that's probably what they mean. Right? But in a sense, I too am playing the same game of locating the things that I think in the earliest period.
So what Pelikan is saying is it's almost like a race to the bottom. Like everybody wants their own tradition to go back as far as possible to the earliest time because that gives them credibility, and they'd much rather point out somebody else's heresy and say, "Oh, well, yours only started a couple of thousand years ago."
Just a couple of hundred, maybe.
Well, right. Maybe,
Look at
yeah.
the time. Yeah. Yes. I mean, we in the very first episode of these podcasts, we mentioned dispensationalism in passing, and I pointed out that it's not taught anywhere since before 1830. So what are you going to do with that? You can cite all the Bible texts you want. If you're really seriously saying that nobody understood the Bible for the first 1800 years, sorry, I'm not going to bother debating you. I just don't believe it. So yes, that kind of stuff does go on. But then people that want to push back on someone like me will want to. They're sometimes forced to make rather difficult arguments that all appearances notwithstanding, something very similar to what they themselves think was nevertheless taught in the earliest centuries. And I'm, as you know, a horrible individual who likes goading them, saying, "Go on then, show me." but yeah, nevertheless that's what's going on here. All right, so just to finish this chunk from Pelikan here, a tradition without history has homogenized, blended together all the stages of development into one statically defined truth. History without tradition has produced a historicism that relativized the development of Christian doctrine in such a way as to make the distinction between authentic growth and cancerous aberration seem completely arbitrary. And so his conclusion now is obvious. We must attempt to avoid the pitfalls of both these methods. We need to balance the two things. Otherwise, if we're just going to have tradition without history, we're going to end up being completely dishonest. And we'll look at an example of that in a moment. But on the other hand, if everything's simply the product of history, well, maybe nothing's true. Or you can make of Christianity whatever you want, which some people do, of course.
Please, I don't have time for an existential crisis. We're going to have to move on.
I'll try and spare you one of those. I don't know why I should, given how rude you are to me, but okay. All right. So let's just consider this whole idea then of tradition. And we'll look at a couple of strands of that, or several strands of that, and how they build themselves up. In the earliest centuries, in fact, the late 2nd century, very beginning of the 3rd, Irenaeus, who was bishop of what we would now call the city of Lyon in southern France, but then would have been Lugdunum in Roman Gaul, the idea of the so-called rule of faith. That is, how do we know that we're understanding the Bible correctly? Now, he's writing at a time when the New Testament, although it's all been written quite a while ago, is not yet completely collected and in the hands of anybody. And most churches have just got a number of these books. So how do we know that some particular interpretation is correct? And so he lays down what he calls a rule of faith, which is like a core of the Christian teaching. And that gives rise, as night follows day, obviously, it's kind of inevitability to the rise of creeds, actual statements of faith. And those have been used down the centuries ever since. Some of them are common to all Christians, particularly those from the earliest centuries. Others tend to cater to things that have become disputed or argued about at a later date. But at any rate, that whole idea we can trace back really to Irenaeus. Not only is he one of the most important of the early church fathers, he is actually a disciple of the Apostle John. So even though he's writing right up to the early 3rd century, he is really, really close to where Christianity begins.
Really only, what is that, maybe 100 or 200 years maybe?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's kind of a consensus that John was the youngest of the apostles and the last one to die, probably sometime in the 90s of the 1st century, right? And when he's an old man, he teaches a young whippersnapper called Polycarp. And Polycarp, in turn, lives to be very old and is martyred in the 150s. I think it's 156, the 150s. And when he's very old, he teaches a young whippersnapper called Irenaeus, who goes on to write loads of this amazing theological stuff when he, in turn, is a church leader in Lugdunum, what we call Lyon. So, yeah, he's only 2 stages removed from the Apostle John. Which brings us neatly to this other idea of the rise of tradition, and that's the concept of apostolic succession. Now, as soon as we use an expression like that, we tend to think immediately of the Catholic idea, right? That bishops have been appointed and consecrated, ordained by previous bishops or popes, and so on, in an unbroken line of succession, finally going back to Christ himself, right? Commissioning the apostles to go out. That's a tricky one to hold on to, because that doesn't necessarily guarantee orthodoxy at all, because, of course, lots of people who've simply been ordained by somebody else might go off the rails, maybe a little bit or maybe completely at some point in their lives. And we've now had 2,000 years for that to happen quite comprehensively. So with the best will in the world, and not in the present Pope or his immediate predecessors at all, we could nevertheless point to some extremely, extremely discreditable episodes in the history of the papacy itself. Quite a bit at the time of the Renaissance, and absolutely terribly in the 10th century. But nevertheless, in the early centuries, this seemed like a good idea, right? How do we know whether this particular teacher, who's very influential, maybe some very charismatic personality, how do we know that what they're teaching is orthodox? Well, are they someone who, like Irenaeus, was appointed by someone like Polycarp, who was appointed by the Apostle John? If so, they're probably good. And even at this distance in time, we still tend to take that view of Irenaeus. But it's not infallible, because people can go pretty far off, and soon they did. But nevertheless, in the early centuries, this was taken as a guide. And because Christians were under persecution from 64 AD onwards for 250 years, basically, if you and I are ordinary Christians and we're coming under persecution and we want guidance as to what we should do and how far we can make concessions to what the authorities are demanding, where we just have to stand our ground and die, then we're going to consult the leaders of churches, and then their guidance, that then becomes a very big issue. The third thing we should point to is Pelikan's trajectory. That is, that ideas in the long run of Christian history tend to pass along a certain line. First off, they're taught by somebody or a series of somebodies somewhere. And then they become embedded either in the church at large or a large swathe of it. So they are, as he says, professed. And finally, it is confessed, in the sense that the idea in question is enshrined in some creed or the official belief of some church body. Now, let's take something that we might not be happy with, but it brilliantly illustrates this kind of trajectory. The idea that the Pope, when he is consciously making a formal doctrinal pronouncement, is infallible. Right? Where did that idea itself come from? Well, it was believed for a long time, but it only becomes a formal doctrine of the Catholic Church at the First Vatican Council in 1870. Right? But nevertheless, it's very widely believed in for hundreds of years before that. So when Martin Luther had just started his little protest that would eventually become the Reformation, he starts off speaking out against the practice of indulgences. If you don't know what that is, it doesn't matter. I know you do, but some of our listeners might not. Don't worry, we'll talk about it another time. And he gets embroiled in a whole load of formal disputations with senior clerics. And his line is, well, the Pope doesn't approve of this, and if he did, he'd rather see St. Peter's reduced to ashes than built with the skin and bones of his flock, the money that they're given by the poor. But finally, he's confronted with evidence that there is papal authority for this. So what are you going to do now, Luther? He doesn't back down. This kind of gulp. Well, the Pope's wrong then. And then sharp intake of breath all around the room. Because there is already, although it's not a formal doctrine, nevertheless, it is widely believed that when the Pope makes a formal doctrinal pronouncement, that's the end of the story. That's it. And of course, there will be a prehistory before that professed stage that Pelikan talks about, where some people simply teach it. Right, and that's going to be earlier in the Middle Ages. So it's taught, then it's professed, widely believed, and then finally it's enshrined in 1870 as a doctrine. And that what Pelikan's saying is a trajectory.
Is he saying this is the way that it should be, or the way that it usually tends to go?
Yeah, no, he's being descriptive. In fact, his whole book is not really prescriptive at all. It's descriptive. This is what has happened, and this is the way things have gone.
I see.
And that's what I'm trying to do here. Not always successfully, as we have seen. Well, how about traditions building on themselves over time? The rise of sacraments emphasizes the institutional authority, the growing authority of the church as a body. So in the earliest period, some people won't agree with this, but I think the evidence certainly seems clear to me. Sacraments are treated with a fairly light hand. They're celebrated fairly informally. Any number of people may participate in sharing the bread and the wine. It's not stipulated who may baptize. But as the view of sacraments increasingly becomes higher, that is, as people drift slowly in the direction of thinking that the body and the bread and the wine do become, in some physical sense, the body and blood of Christ. As people move more and more towards the view that being baptized somehow makes you a Christian, that by going into the water, then the obvious response to that is that you will start to restrict who may carry out these ceremonies. And eventually it coalesces around, that one man leader there. And that in turn indicates some kind of institutional authority for the church as an institution rather than simply the collectivity of all Christians. And that's the process we can see going on through those first. Well, it would suit me if I could say, that this is really what happens in the 4th and 5th centuries, but honesty compels me to admit that it's drifting that way during the first 3, right? Particularly once we get to the late 2nd century. What about another aspect of this development of tradition? Well, obviously, the New Testament didn't exist during the time of the New Testament. Duh, right? The first of the New Testament books to have been written is, scholars think, almost certainly Galatians in the mid-50s, right? And it's pretty much all written by the 90s of the 1st century, but John kind of wrapping things up there. So, but how and when does it emerge as an entity? Well, this is a question that a lot of people tend not to think about. So if you listen to the normal evangelical patter, they will say, oh, we're not like those Catholics or like those Orthodox. We rely upon the Bible. To which the Catholic response is absolutely obvious. Well, how do you know which books are in the Bible? Well, it was agreed by church councils in the 360s, right? So therefore, the authority of the institutional church logically precedes the authority of the New Testament. This is something I used
Right.
to wave in front of my students, and they used to look back at me with a look of terror on their faces, which was the purpose of my exercise. I've been the cruel man you've always correctly taken me for. So we'd just let them stew in that
Of course.
for a minute or two and see if they could come back with some kind of reply. I mean, there is a reply, which is that the church councils are basically simply what the church is, plural, had always accepted as having canonical scriptural status. Right? They were simply recognizing what different churches had always recognized between them. So it's not that kind of institutional thing. The argument is a lot more complicated than that. So loads of people can make comments underneath underneath this video on YouTube or something, pointing out all the difficulties with that. I know there's a whole lot of difficulties with that, and at some stage we will deal with them. But in simplistic essence, that is the nature of that discussion. Well, let's have a look now at perhaps the three most important stances concerning tradition, and then we'll and then we'll look at what's wrong with them.
You have the three here: Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Evangelical. But those aren't the only three categories.
No, well, but they certainly account for the largest number of people. The main groups that I've left out there are the Eastern churches, people like Copts and Assyrians and these kind of people, whose views will be very similar to those of the Eastern Orthodox, even if not identical. And what we laughingly call mainline Protestants, that is those churches that have shrunk to almost nothing in consequence of embracing liberal theology in the 20th century, and they differ a little amongst themselves. But I think, in looking at these three, we're looking at the three general views, and this is inevitably a caricature because I'm simplifying for the sake of contrasting, that people are likely to encounter. Well, what do Eastern Orthodox typically say? They would say our worship and traditions are exactly as they were in the New Testament. Doctrine is perfectly formulated in the first 7 ecumenical councils. Quick check here. Ecumenical does not mean historically what it's come to mean over the last 100 years or so. It doesn't mean a load of different denominations seeing if there's something they can find in common and boil doctrine down to the lowest common denominator. Ecumenical means from across the oikumene, the world at large. Right? So general councils of the church. So doctrine's perfectly formulated in those first 7 ecumenical councils, following which the last of those 7 was in 787. There's nothing to be added. So that simply defines doctrine perfectly. That's it. And our practice and our doctrine is exactly as it was in the beginning. Well, of these three, the Roman Catholic is, at least in principle, the most realistic, although there's problems with it, as we shall see. So the Roman Catholic view is that practice and doctrine do develop over time. So there's an honesty about that. But the developments build upon and refine what was always there before, in embryo, so to speak. They can't contradict it. Now, in the case of the Roman Catholic Church, that's kind of true, and it would certainly be good if it were completely true, but it's not, as we'll see in a moment. The evangelical view is at least as unrealistic as the Orthodox one. We go back to the Bible, unmediated by any traditions. The former, the Bible, is divinely inspired. The latter, traditions are merely human. Now, I realise I'm caricaturing there a little bit what evangelicals say. Perhaps it'd be the fundamentalist wing that would take that kind of approach most completely, but nevertheless, that's the direction in which they tend. Well,
pretty accurate.
Yeah. I would say that all of these are delusions to an extent. Let's deal with the Eastern Orthodox one first. The early church obviously did not look like the Orthodox Church with its icons, priestly regalia, and liturgy. Although they would insist, as Western Catholics insisted in the Middle Ages, that Luke was the first icon painter. It just seems bizarre to us, but nevertheless, it's that kind of argument that you're going to have to fall back on if you want to take this sort of approach. Now, the strength of this is that it leaves the church invulnerable to modern liberalism, because doctrine's been defined once and for all. That's it. There really is not a lot further to be said. You can apply it to the modern world to an extent, or even, but even that hasn't been a large scale activity within the Orthodox Church, we'd have to say. But it makes the church culturally rigid and not really able to engage with society. What about the Roman Catholic case? Well, a lot of current practices and doctrinal views do, in fact, contradict those of earlier centuries. So the law of non-contradiction doesn't really work. Well, that's a nice idea. Yes, there's been development over time, but some of that development has been overturning what was believed before. To take just one rather large modern example of that, the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s overturned loads and loads, at least by implication, of what had been determined in Vatican I, never mind in previous centuries. But my point here is that there certainly is contradiction with what's gone before. And as for the evangelicals, well, I hardly know what to say. I mean, evangelical groups change faster over time than any others. And what the Bible says demonstrably changes with the cultural idioms of the surrounding society. Now, that's very nice in terms of they can sound relevant wherever they're going, right? But please, it makes it absolutely impossible to defend any idea of static truth, which is really hilarious when you think of how not all evangelicals, but a goodly number of them keep falling back on the expression objective truth to counter modern relativism, right? Well, if the truth is objective, all we can do is point out that in evangelical churches it's changing all the time. So this is a problem, I feel. Well, it hasn't caused everybody to have problems digesting their breakfast. Let's look at a particularly subversive idea here, but one that studying church history makes unavoidable, and that is that doctrine follows practice, not vice versa. Now, I think we would all agree that ideally, practice should follow doctrine. Historically, the opposite thing happens, right? That we start doing things a certain kind of way, and then later on, we come along with some spiritual sounding rhetoric or some Bible verses that seem to support this particular way of doing things. And the Bible is, as we've often pointed out, a very large book. And there you go, we've turned it into a new doctrine. Now let's just take three things here, three examples, and I'm going to touch on them very lightly. And if you don't like what we're saying, not you, our listeners, if listeners don't like what we're saying here, they can complain in the comments section. But we will deal with them, probably most of them anyway, in later episodes. We're about to do a series on early Christianity following immediately after this series.
Just going back, this is, the same thing as Pelikan. We were looking at Pelikan earlier, saying, he says there's sort of a process for how this happens, and so these are some examples of what he was saying. Yeah.
Yes. Well, in the earliest centuries, church councils were summoned. They gathered together so that church leaders could meet with one another and talk about common problems, pastoral issues, how to deal with the state that was persecuting them, and also talking together if some heresy has arisen. Well, if this is wrong, what's the right line? What should we take? Right. So, and church councils have met pretty much ever since, one way and another. Well, it was an absolutely obvious move for the leader of the church in the biggest city to call together such church councils, right? There were a number of big cities in the Roman Empire. Let that keep going every few years for several generations, or even 100 years or 200 years, and it becomes the right of the church leader in that city to call the other bishops together. And lo and behold, the phenomenon of archbishops has emerged as someone who's got rather more authority than ordinary bishops. And actually, the process of building hierarchy goes on from there. We're not going to pursue that now. And so along comes some kind of rationale, logical extension, spiritual rhetoric, maybe Bible verses, to prove that this is the right way to do things. Let's take another example. As we've said, Christians are being persecuted between, well, certainly on and off, pretty regularly, between 64 AD and 313. So it made sense for lots of ordinary Christians emotionally to commemorate the martyrdoms of local Christians, people who had been one of us, who were then horribly killed on the anniversary of their martyrdoms, right, of their death. And we come, with the passing of time, we come to feel that they've got a special connection with us. They're our person already in heaven, waiting for us, maybe interceding for us at the throne. And so slowly what's building up is a doctrine about saints' days and patron saints and so on. In the earliest period, and we are going to be devoting a chunk of time to this, there are women leaders, there are prophetic bands travelling around, particularly in the second century. And there's the kind of a power struggle, actually, inside the church between roving bands of prophets, that certainly included women, and local congregational leaders. And this battle was eventually, by the end of the second century, won in most places by the latter, by the congregational leaders. And in consequence of that, you start to get a rationale building up against having women in active public leadership, and a rhetoric insisting upon this point. Now, of course, I've just been playing the usual game there, that we're deconstructing these resultant doctrines. Well, how would I feel if someone started to do the same thing with the doctrine of the Trinity? As we know, the term Trinity isn't mentioned in the New Testament, right? It isn't actually mentioned for the first couple of 100 years of Christian history, until Tertullian, church father in North Africa, coins the term early in the 3rd century. What are we going to say? Well, what I would want to say, and perhaps I hope here I'm being faithful to Pelikan, is not that using history to analyse is illegitimate, but you can't follow it all the way through. It can be, this kind of development of doctrine can be perfectly legitimate if it reflects what was already there. And at that point, we can go scrabbling around for our Bible verses to show that this was considered to be God, and the same point in respect of the Holy Spirit. That work has been done many times. I'd want to say that it's even easier to look at the writings of the earliest Christians from the 1st century all the way through the 2nd, up to Tertullian's own time. And all of them are constantly using Trinitarian formulae, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, giving thanks for these communion elements in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Some people even being baptized like 3 times, once Father, once the Son, once the Holy Spirit. And this kind of formula being used in prayer language and so on. So the doctrine of the Trinity is simply expressing what Christians had already believed. So we can say that that's a legitimate development. Okay, well, just to consider briefly here, can we, like the Orthodox, actually really live without change? The Eastern Orthodox Church seems to believe so, and the illusion of timelessness is the reason for its appeal in rootless societies of perpetual churn in the West, perhaps particularly in the US. A number of evangelicals we've noticed in the last generation or so have gone over to Eastern Orthodoxy, and really that's related to people's sense of not belonging anywhere. They feel that, if a Blogstown Community Church just was established in 1985, and it just feels like they're kind of making it up on the spur of the moment. So the Orthodox Church gives them, rescues them from that sense. Now, I'm the kind of hooligan who could jump in and say, well, that too has a history, and of course that they would get extremely uncomfortable with that, and real, let's say, native Orthodox would probably get quite angry at me. But Orthodoxy is certainly a bulwark against intellectual fashions and social change, and that's got to be a good thing. But to succeed, it has to do one of two things. Either it must close down intellectual exploration and become force for extreme conservatism, or to become a separate compartment in the lives of believers themselves, closed off from the modern world of politics and culture in which people actually live, and reducing itself to a mere spirituality. And in practice, Orthodox churches have tried both in varying combinations, including in the Orthodox Church's home countries like Russia or Romania or Bulgaria. And the other problem with it is it also makes it very hard to evangelize into markedly different cultures, because the person who's becoming a Christian under those circumstances has to buy not simply a faith and a belief or being confronted with Christ, they need to buy this culture that comes with it. Well, that's a hindrance.
I think I wonder, though, too, if some of the appeal is that you can walk into an Orthodox church, probably pretty much anywhere in the world, and it's going to look and feel the same no matter where you are. And I wonder if that's part of the appeal of it, that you know exactly what to expect when you walk in there.
Yes, there is that. Well, I mean, I think that's an even more powerful argument in respect of the Roman Catholic Church. But I think what you're saying is right. There is that to a significant extent in the Orthodox Church as well. Well, what about the Catholic Church and tradition building itself over time? As I've said, maybe the Catholic approach is the most realistic. It combines continuity with flexibility, both over time and nowadays across cultures as well. And it also allows for intellectual exploration. Intellectual rigidity during the early modern period was one of the causes of the Catholic Church losing a lot of ground to Protestantism or to secularism, or the ossification of ardently Catholic societies, most notably Spain. How does Spain sink from being one of the greatest powers in the late 16th century to being pretty much helpless in the face of all the other Western powers by the time you get to the 19th century? Well, the answer is the rigidity of its particular brand of Catholicism, right? It's kind of ossified. But that's not true of the wider Roman Catholic story. But nevertheless, the reality of actual contradiction over time means that the ideal becomes increasingly implausible. Implicitly, it relies on most Catholic believers today, not knowing that this is the case, and so upon the maintenance of an illusion. But they're hardly unique in that respect. Well, what about the third of our cases? Can we really live without tradition? Many fundamentalists, and indeed many postmodern groups, seem to think that we can. And yet all of them, except those that really veer off into heresy, want to adhere to the doctrine of the Trinity. And in practice, all of them rapidly develop traditions of their own, built upon their own interpretations of the Bible, or practices developed early within the particular group. So if you doubt that, if you and I went to a traditional small Pentecostal church, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with these, but I could tell you in advance exactly what we could find, and it would be a kind of slightly ossified version of what would have been there in the early 20th century, because it's just become like a tradition. That's how we do things. And you could tell a similar story in respect of other evangelical groups. And it then becomes sinful to depart from those. Right? So a classic example, a friend of mine in South Wales, who I think listens to these podcasts, John Tancock, he told me a story one time about going up to preach in a little church in the South Wales valleys one day. And he preached there and it went fine. And the pastor asked him back for dinner with his family and all this. And then he started to say, they started to talk about teaching about the end times. And John asked them what view they took. And the pastor said, we don't subscribe to any of the particular views or traditions at all. We just take it straight from the word. And he then started to explain exactly what he and his group thought. And it was, word for word, exactly what you would have got in his particular kind of tradition. It had simply been embedded there. Right?
Yeah.
Sorry, South Wales, one of the very few accents that I can do convincingly. All right. Well, what about the Christian past, the history side of all this? Here's a rather delicious introduction to this by a man called Douglas Frank. His book was written about 40 years ago now, with a wonderful title, Less Than Conquerors, How Evangelicals Entered the 20th Century. And he's just reflecting upon his own experiences as a youngster. And he says, I once read about certain primitive tribes people who, when asked how they come to live on their particular spot of earth, replied that their ancestors had descended from the heavens on a vine. And I grew up thinking something very similar about where evangelicals had come from. We were simply the current manifestation of the first century church, as modified very slightly after a long period of Roman darkness by the Protestant Reformation. But exactly how we'd gotten here from there was shrouded in a mystery that no one seemed interested in exploring. That the particulars of our journey through history might have something to do with our present beliefs and practices didn't seem to occur to anybody. And this left us fairly naive and unself-critical at best. At worst, it tempted us to self-righteousness, as if we had escaped the ravages of history by our own merits and thus embodied the only faithful remnant still in evidence.
Well, that doesn't sound too far off from a typical Christian kid's experience, I don't think.
Right. That's close to what you experienced?
I think so. I don't remember, learning a lot of, by which I mean we didn't learn any, church history when I was growing up, and it was just sort of assumed that we were the newest generation of the church that had always existed, so.
Right. Which in a sense, of course, is true, but it's the stuff that's implied along with it, isn't it? Yeah. Rather than anything else.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I can afford to feel superior and smug here because I wasn't brought up with this stuff at all. I did not have either Frank's or your kind of upbringing, so hence my propensity for being a hooligan in the present. It comes more easily to me.
Yeah, the benefits of being an absolute heathen.
Yes, this is exactly right. Okay, well, let's just close in now on, what I have found to be some of the most persistent, complete misunderstandings, fundamental misunderstandings that I found students have somehow imbibed, whether through school or church or something else over the years, and which every single year I needed to kind of push out of the way. And you tell me in each case whether this was something that came at you. So I've called it here fundamental mistakes about the Christian past. Number one, Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Did you get that one?
Wait, you mean that's not true?
You're a wicked, wicked woman.
Yeah,
Every
I would
year.
say this one's pretty prevalent.
It is pretty prevalent. Yeah. And it makes one wonder why so many people believe it. Because it's not a debatable question. I mean, there's no evidence for that, whatever. You will not get this idea reflected in any history book, except something like a Becker, which doesn't count as history, but counts as grumpy old fundamentalist white men having a rant about things in general. Right, but no history book will actually give you that. What they will actually tell you correctly is that Constantine stopped persecuting Christianity and started to give it various privileges. It doesn't actually really become the formal religion of the late Roman Empire for another 70 years. And that 70 years is a period of transition and massive changes inside Christianity. Okay, well, the second one, Christianity stood against all science and hindered progress. And this has been a very powerful idea since the late 19th century, I would guess. Now, obviously, most churches aren't going to come out and say this, or Christian homes or Christian schools, but I think that the backwash is it's going to be there in the sense that maybe this is true and that therefore perhaps our young people going off to study science-related subjects is something to be nervous about. Now, did you get this impression when you were growing up?
Yeah, I do think so. There were, definitely some people that would probably, like parents would caution you against, well, science isn't everything, and, make sure that you're spending more time on your faith than you are in science. And I think there was definitely a fear of it.
Right. And I suppose one of the reasons this idea has so much credence is because of discussions around the theory of evolution and trying to reconcile that with early Genesis and so on. Now, that's something, this just occurs to me as I'm saying this, that's something to which we really ought to give an episode at some future point. But at the time that Darwin was writing, most Christians weren't in any kind of panic about this. This is something that seemed to become a big issue by around the late 19th century. And then then it becomes like a kind of a cause célèbre, something that causes loads of pushback during the course of the 20th century. But even the stories around that include a whole load of myths. But the longer run story is quite the opposite, that Christianity, for most of its history, actually promoted scientific discovery and scientific development. I mean, another case that's held up, as it were, in support of the idea that Christianity stood against science is the case of Galileo and Pope Urban VIII. But in fact, these two guys have been friends. Galileo comes with the idea, or develops the idea, of a heliocentric universe, that the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. He wasn't quite the first person to get there, but he kind of establishes it. And he had been warned that the church didn't much like this idea and he needed to express it cautiously. And he deliberately expressed it incautiously, including hurling abuse at his former friend. And what was his punishment? Was he burned at the stake? No, he wasn't. Was he imprisoned? No, he wasn't. He was simply prevented from formally teaching within the institutions that he had been working in. Right? So he had been a bit provocative. I mean, that doesn't excuse the papacy. It doesn't excuse the Catholic Church for the line that they did take. But is it some kind of horrendous clash between religion and science? No, it's not. We then come to another non-debatable one, but nevertheless it is so tenaciously and widely believed in. The idea that the Protestant reformers wanted religious toleration. Right? And I found that loads and loads of students had kind of grown up with this idea. The Catholic Church was the church of persecution, and the Protestant reformers didn't want this. Did you get this, either tacitly or explicitly, or not really?
I don't think we got enough history to have this be addressed.
Okay. Well, certainly I found that a lot of people had imbibed this idea. And of course, it's not true. It's a disgrace that it wasn't true, but it isn't true. What Luther and Calvin and the others wanted was, they were quite agreed with the Catholics, that what they wanted was a compulsory church enforced on the population as a whole, but their own right one, as opposed to the Catholics' wrong one. Religious toleration has grown up under very different circumstances. Partly, it has to be admitted, from the failure of various Protestant churches to make themselves stick in quite the way they wanted in some countries. And out of that failure eventually religious toleration emerged, particularly in Britain, the Netherlands, and America. Right? All those countries have been used to patting themselves on the back as what fine, insightful fellows they are for having religious toleration, you know. But in fact, they all tried persecution, and as my chief theologian, Winnie the Pooh, would put it, it just wouldn't.
And I think, every time you and I have a conversation about this, because it's not the first time that you and I have talked about it together, I always sort of leave with a horrible feeling of, well, where should I be going to church? I'm sort of out of options at this point. But so maybe you can describe, some instances of churches that you've seen who have done this really well, where they have been able to integrate,
Right.
history and tradition into their daily practice with a modern congregation of people.
Right. Well, a much cruder version of asking the question you just asked gets put around here in the Balkans all the time. So if you try to have a discussion about some of these things, people will instantly revert to, so what is the right church? Right? The implication, a lot of them, is say in Croatia that you ought to be Catholic, or in Serbia that you should be Orthodox, right? But actually, local evangelicals have got themselves stuck into the same groove as well and end up distorting the things that they ought to think because they're still playing the same game. We are the right church as opposed to the Catholics or the Orthodox. Wrong one, or something like that. And as soon as we do that, then we've made a mistake, right? The right way to ask the question is the way that you asked it. There isn't an easy cut and dried answer. Clearly, the mistake made by a lot of evangelicals is to think that you can just ignore 2,000 years of development and of history and just leap from where we are back to the Bible. And magically, every time, what the Bible says turns out to be the prejudices of your country and social group, and probably these days, generation as well. Right? So, which in a sense just demonstrates the point I'm trying to make, right? So, it's not that we shouldn't try to be relevant to the culture that we're in. We should, but we need to have a pretty firm grasp on what the broad Christian tradition has been over time, that we're aware of it, we're aware of the alternative choices that have been made, and therefore that we too could make, and then use our prayerful judgment and intellectual discretion to make the ones that seem right. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. My favourite person for balancing a load of these questions, evangelical enthusiasm with a real grasp of Christian history and the choices that are there and the things that need to be at the forefront, would be someone like Roger Forster, a major church leader in Britain who sadly died just about 2 months ago. It seemed to me that he kind of hit each of those kind of nails on the head. But it becomes easier if we have plural leadership, if we're not just hanging upon one genius or something like that, and we're allowing different the expertise of different people to feed into the process of leadership, mutually correcting one another. So yeah, it means that we need well-informed leaders, and we need certainly more than one of them, I would say, in congregations to help us to navigate through the times that we're in, whilst hanging on to the core of Christian orthodoxy. Yeah.
Right.
It's not a very satisfactory answer, is it? But
So
I think it's probably the best way.
There's a sliver of hope, is what you're telling me.
There's a sliver of hope amidst the gloom. And about what we're going to be doing, we should tell our viewers what we're going to be doing starting next week is beginning a series. It'll be the first of 2 series on the early church. We're going to do this for 6 weeks, and then we'll cover a whole lot of other things in completely different areas, and we'll come back to the early church some months later on. So that's for next week. We'll be starting off there. what kind of people became Christians and why did they do that in the first century or two. So, goodbye, everybody, and thank you for staying with us.
And we'll see you next week.